Hey everyone, welcome to part 4 in this Delorean comprehensive brake rebuild series. The last video kicked off with the rear driver side tire, removing the tire to expose the brake and the testing of the emergency brake. This was followed by the removal of the emergency brake. The two bolts were carefully loosened to be able to remove the brake caliper from the car. The old flex line was a challenge to remove. One side required a puller to do so. The pads were removed from the calipers and the calipers were disassembled. The emergency brake was degreased, cleaned, and inspected. As was both of the calipers, the rear calipers stood up very well over the last 40 years. We can see the original plating. Finally, the bore for the pistons was cleaned out and they sat here awaiting new parts, which has just arrived. Just as before, it's coated with a preservative, so we're going to clean it off right quick. Clean out my preservation oil that I sprayed into these calipers before I put in the new rubber seal. The seal's installed with a thin layer of brake fluid pressed in straight. And this is all the same process as the previous calipers, so I'm not getting into a great degree of detail as I add more brake fluid now on top of that seal to put in the piston. It's identical from the front pistons as I've done in chapters 1 through 3. And pretty much par for the course, I push it in too far, so I'm going to need to take air to blow it out and try that again and get it to the right position, just like that, so I could get that rubber seal to that lip over there. But first I want to put a little bit of grease around that area that gets heavily rusted. It always looks like more grease than it really is on camera as a preventative measure. So now I put that rubber seal on top and press it around. Maybe it's a bit too high as shown, so I have to lower it just a little bit, being careful not to push it all the way in again, or I have to repeat that process. But now I can put that rubber seal around the lip on the bottom. And once it's fully seated on the bottom, I can put that metal locking ring, which I didn't record for some reason, but here's that metal locking ring around the seal. I've recorded that on 3 other calipers, so we know what that looks like. And I actually pushed it up a little bit of air to see what it looks like with that dust cap showing it raised slightly. Same procedure for the other half. Try not to push it in too far. This time I didn't have to push it out with air. Able to set everything up, getting it to the right depth so I could put that dust seal on correctly. I always put the lock ring opening towards the bottom. It's not necessary, I just do it. And here's the second half, now all completed, ready to go. In the last video, I said I would replace this pin, so I can do it now. Pop the old one out, slide the new one in, bend the tabs over, and it's done. Been shaking the bolts into degreaser for the last week or so. Washed them off, cleaned up real nice. Very light coat of anti-seize on these bolts. Wipe down the mating surfaces on both sides quickly. And now both halves will be brought together. I'm going to drop in all 4 bolts now, and I'm going to finger turn them all the way in. They should go in without any resistance. Set my torque wrench to around 32 foot-pounds, and I start with the inside ones first and work my way outward. This pipe has been cleaned ready for installation. It should thread on both sides by hand without any resistance. At which point they'll both be gently snugged down. The caliper is now fully assembled. I'm reusing these brake pads, so I'm going to clean up the brake pads with brake cleaner just in case got any grease or oil on them. I've marked which one goes where on disassembly so I know the right direction when I reinstall them. I have all new parts for the installation. And I've put just a small amount of anti-seize in the back of both pads. As I drop them into place, my fingers are under here just to support it on the bottom of the caliper. Lining it up, I put the first pin through. Checking that it's fully seated, having made its way all the way through to the other side, I place the pin in to lock it into position through the hole in that pin. Then the second pin goes through, lifting up the brake pads to align the holes. Seats all the way at the other end. Second pin goes in to lock it. This caliper is now ready for installation. Along with the caliper, I do have this rigid line that does have to be reinstalled. I've already cleaned the ends of it. And of course the emergency brake too. So I raised this side back up. It's been lowered since I washed everything out and covered the new line. I'm going to have to install this line into the bracket first. Remove the protective tape. Putting anti-seize on the first few threads as well as the flats as I've done before on the other lines. Then I'll place the cable end into the fixture and use a mirror to verify it's sitting correctly. The washer and nut will be placed on. One more inspection with the mirror shows everything to be installed correctly. Time to give the rotor a quick clean with cob cleaner on the inside and outside of the rotor. And with the brake pad spread all the way out, I lay the caliper back down onto the rotor, aligning the position of the two holes where the bolts are, immediately putting the bolt in on the bottom because it's easy to reach. I come around the top and get a couple turns on that top bolt, not so easy to reach, but a couple turns will suffice to hold it. And then with a ratchet, I work the top one in, just a couple more. Knowing the top one will stay in, I could come around and work the bottom one all the way in. I set my torque wrench to 40 foot-pounds and torque the bottom and top bolts to 40 foot-pounds. Now the rigid line needs to be reinstalled, working from the back of the car forward. It's installed loosely so that it can be adjusted. If everything's set up right, it should be able to be turned in on the top, finger turned without any resistance. There's a plastic retainer right here it snaps into on the side of the frame. There's only room for a stubby on the inner connection, so I use that 13 right here to gently snug it down against the new hose that was just installed. After that, the side connecting to the caliper is snugged down. And I snug down the bleeder valve. With that, the primary brake portion of this job is now installed. We have to do the e-brake now. Verify one last time that the routing of this rigid line is correct before we continue. So I'm just going to lower the e-brake right into these two receptacles, making sure again that that rigid line does not bind with the e-brake. And everything from an over and under inspection appears to be in good order. I'm not going to be reusing this washer. I'm swapping it out for a new one, so I'm transferring the bolts as we see here. Placing these onto the return spring with some anti-seize at the ends. And they're going to lower into these holes. I do have to make sure the e-brakes are lined up for these posts to go down, because the threads are just on top, but these are all posts that make their way to the bottom. So when they're lined up, I make sure that the return springs are pushed into position, and I could turn these in by hand all the way to the bottom, like so. There's only about 5.5 6 foot-pounds of torque to tighten these, so don't over tighten this or you'll snap it. It is a tiny bolt. That's what the locking tab is for, so be careful. I'm going to reconnect the emergency brake cable back onto the emergency brake now. And when I was working earlier, I had pushed it in and out of the way. I'm going to show you what happened when I did that. But first we're going to reconnect it, because I don't know that at the time. So I'm up front with my hand through the window and I'm about to pull the e-brake handle. And watch what happens. It just fell off the track. Up front by the handle. The cable just fell out. So now I'm wondering what's going on. I pull it back again and nothing happens. I come over and I'm checking why the brake's not engaged. Not knowing that the cable's now out of the track and there's nothing but slop here. It's going to take me a minute to figure this out. So I'm going to have to disconnect this connection, push this cable all the way forward, and then go around to the actual e-brake handle and get it back on the track up front. We'll take a look at that connection by the handle. I'll pull the brake so we could get a better view of this. Here's the track where the cable fell out of. I had to compress the other side to make it as long as possible, guide it back up in between these two splines, then pull the emergency brake to hold it in place, and then release the other side. And that's how I got it back in the track. The cable's fixed, so I'm going to set up the e-brake now, removing this cotter pin first. And I make these adjustments with this screw a half a turn at a time and measure. And this is what I'm working with. I'm doing it by clicks, fully disengaging the brake first. and I want obviously no connection. It's emergency brake, so I don't want it engaged at all touching the rotor. So I want a couple clicks of grace, and that first click I check, and I could even look and see there's no bind whatsoever, so that's good. And the second click also, no bind at all. Optimally, I'm looking for a couple clicks of no bind in the beginning and a couple clicks after it's fully bound at the end. So it's in the middle. Now it's slightly touching at 4, and by 5 already it's binding, as we see here. Now onto the 6th click. It's barely movable, so it's tightly bound, and already on the 7th click it's locked up. The brakes are already biting down on the rotor, right? So everything after the 7th click is just going to be just extra at the end. So it's just a plus. So I got number 8, number 9, and number 10 is 3 more clicks after that. This is perfect. This is exactly where I want to be. I put the pin back in, and the ebrake is now set up. And I want the other side to be like that too. So now I'm going to tap in these locking clips on these screws. And this brake is all done. Now I check to make sure I didn't leave any tools behind, no sockets from ratchets left somewhere. Get this set up, put the wheel back on. Wheel's been washed and scrubbed on both sides. Thin coat of anti-seize on the mating surface. And this side is done till it's time for bleeding the brakes. We'll just lower the wheel back down and move on. As usual for the second wheel, I'm not going to cover everything all over again, just highlighted sections that are relevant to the second wheel or as compared to the first wheel. And one of these things, obviously the emergency brake, I want to see how it's working before I take things apart. And we can see that it's not binding. I see there is clearance, mechanical separation here. Pulling it all the way in and drop it back out. And then without the ratchet and drop it back out. Luckily on this side I was able to remove this panel, allowing much better access to this really crappy bracket. My luck ended there because the other side of this hose is in the absolutely worst location between the transmission and the frame, way up there. I zoomed out so we could see it, and I have to lay on my side with my arm in the air, tying a box end of the wrench so I don't drop it. I can't begin to describe how ergonomic this was. All the while, I got the whole area packed with paper towels so it don't spill any brake fluid onto the transmission or the frame while I'm making this disconnection. And with the wrench tied to my wrist, I was eventually able to make the disconnection with the rigid line to the hose as we see here, but that was the easy part. Luckily, I was able to get my arm up there with a breaker bar and a deep well, and then ultimately a ratchet. I have just enough room. I was able to break that nut free and start turning it one click at a time. Got it up to the top so I could use like a small peening hammer to agitate it while I worked with a pair of vice grips from the back, and it took a long time to break it free from the rust. Eventually getting this thing loose. It was terrible, but I got it out, and this part of the line is now removed, and this was the worst of it because I have easy access to that other bracket, and I was able to get this part out with my puller from the shovel head, so this popped right out with no issue. Before I pulled it, however, I did want to take note with the vice grips how set fast this is in there, but it is removed, and I hated this hose. It was the worst part of the project. New stuff goes in easy. It's just acrobatics trying to get the washers and the nut on there. That's all. Just like putting on the rigid line again, more acrobatics and more work with a wrench just tied to my wrist, but it got done. And it's back in. Don't want to do that again. Which brings me back to business as usual, washing everything down inside and out, remove any possible brake fluid, and lower the side until we're ready to come back to it. Now I'm going to be testing out this emergency brake, and I want to get it in the ballpark like the other one. I'll be doing the final brake settings when it's on the lift at the Bug Ranch. But for now, It's just going to be these incremental adjustments, lock it down, test it out. Six grabs, 7 locks up, and the rest is... Could have set up both e-brakes properly in the garage if I lifted up both back wheels at the same time, but I knew this was going on the lift, so I wasn't worried about it. Leaving the passenger rear wheel in the air, I move over to the reservoir, having purchased 2 quarts of .4 brake fluid. I attempt what will be a partial brake bleed, which I know is in vain on this system, because we see it's only spraying out one side, and I try and cover it with my finger, but it's not going to do anything, and that's fine. I got some fluid in there. I'm going to cap it up, clean up my mess, and just put these pieces back in so I don't spill anything on the way to the car. I'll remove the old seal I left on here as a reminder. We can see the condition that was in. And I have a new seal from Delorean Go that I'll now place on here. Both of these studs were clean and anti-seize was applied. And I'm now going to clean up the ends of these rigid line connectors. Also placing a small towel down under here to prevent any spillage from occurring. Now installing the reservoir and master cylinder. Shimmied onto the studs to full seat. There's a washer and a nut that needs to be reattached onto each side. This inner one is a little harder to reach, and it's a pain if you drop it. You have to go fish it out with a magnet. Luckily I didn't drop it. Get a couple turns on there and you're safe. And then both of these nuts will be snugged down. I just keep going back and forth to snug it down evenly, not just on one side. Drop my socket into the frame and fish it out with a magnet. The rigid connections go into the master cylinder one at a time now. I've cleaned all the threads. These should finger turn in. No problem at all. Just right at the end, I go and turn it so I don't bust up my fingers. But there should be no resistance until the end when I gently snug it down. It's only several foot-pounds. That's it. And it's done. I do the next one in the same fashion. And snug it down to completion. And it's installed. This entire area is then sprayed with a detergent. And I wipe down everything, removing all brake fluid residue. We'll now reopen up the reservoir. Shake it off. And top it off. And by top it off, I mean we can see this air bubble all the way up top is completely filled. And I set up for vacuuming on the rear passenger caliper. As this gets underway, I'm not just bleeding the brake system, I'm also trying to pull any of the residual crap out of the system. I have to monitor and fill the reservoir as needed. The rear passenger is the most crucial bleed, I think, because it's the furthest from the master cylinder. I do stop though after a minute to take an inspection of the fluid and then empty and clean this container so I could do it again. Satisfied with the bleed, I take the newly supplied end caps and place one on the bleeder after I clean it. And for this wheel, I end up putting the shield back on. This was also the last wheel cleaning. The other rear wheel was done in the exact same manner. Didn't take as long, however, to get good results. On the front calipers, I'd put these pins in backwards, so I'd taken time to reverse them back to original. The front calipers go much quicker than the rear, given the distance to the master cylinder. At this point, I've been through an entire quart of brake fluid. I've also reversed the pins on this final brake. These aren't synchronized videos, but it shows what I was doing with a small broom on the brake pedal so that I could watch both the caliper on the front driver's side as well as the reservoir and make sure it wasn't going too low as fluid filled up in all of these separate calipers as the pads closed down on the rotors. So it took obviously several pumps to accomplish this. And I know that there's going to be a small amount of air still in the system. We're still going to be doing a conventional bleeding when it's on the lift. None of these wheels have been torqued yet. I use the accepted community value of 65 foot-pounds. I do this in a progressive cross-tightening motion. But now I finally have all 4 wheels back on the ground, and I'm putting the cap back on the reservoir. And I want to see how the pedal feels with my foot. So first I'm trying it with the car off without the vacuum assist, and the squeaky sound is my jacket on the seat. It's not the brake pedal. And the car off brake pedal does feel okay. The car running brake pedal also feels like I remember it. This will obviously still benefit from a regular conventional brake bleed, but again, it doesn't feel like there's anything wrong here. We're doing some baby steps in the garage, backing up really slow, checking for mechanical noises, and making sure the thing actually brakes. You know the drill. I'm extremely confident this car could stop at about 5 miles an hour. The emergency brake, it works but barely. On the road, I tested it. I eventually went through the neighborhood at about 25 miles an hour. I didn't do it on camera, obviously, and the e-brake will stop the car but barely, but it hasn't been set up yet. At the shop, we're going to put it up on the lift now for a final inspection. First order of business, every single brake junction on the entire car is going to be inspected. Drove it around the neighborhood, drove it another 20 miles. We're going to see if there's any leaks on any of these junctions. And I'll tell you right now, after a thorough inspection, there's not a single leak. So I'm very happy with that. Between the master cylinder and the flex hose changeouts, there was a lot of stuff disconnected and reconnected on this job. The emergency brake is in the release position, and I'm loosening the adjuster screw on both emergency brakes now. I've shortened both adjustments such that neither of them bind. We can see it spins freely. And I've clicked up the emergency brake 5 clicks. With it 5 clicks up, I adjust the brake until the tension gets tighter and tighter until I can no longer turn it with my hands. Make my way over to the other brake and do the exact same thing on this side. You can see that as I tighten it down, it actually loosens up the brake a bit. So I came back and reset this, doing it for 4 clicks instead of 5. Notice that I could now turn the rotor after it was tightened down. Incremental tests were done as I adjusted it, and the brakes are now even where they lock up. Finally, an old school bleeding was done on each caliper using the pedal method. I don't know if that's beneficial. It's just something I always do after I do the vacuum method, getting the air bubbles out. And then finished off by washing the entire undercarriage. And that concludes this major brake maintenance project for this 1982 DeLorean. I hope you found this video enjoyable, entertaining, and informative. Do me a favor, hit that like button down below. Helps me out a lot when you do. And hit that subscribe button for more videos like this when they come out. When the next video comes out in this series, a link will be posted in the top right corner. Again, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching. Would you like to reply?